In 1997, Steve Jobs gave a talk at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference where he shared this incredible wisdom. The line of code that is fastest to write, that never breaks, that doesn't need maintenance, is a line you didn't have to write. I think this is one of the great quotes about how complicated we make systems that don't necessarily require it. In IT, we tend to learn, incorporate new techniques, try new technology, think through what our systems could look like, and try to find ways to improve or perfect our code. We tend to always be trying to get better at the craft, hoping that the work we do today is better than the code we wrote yesterday, a year ago, 10 years ago. If you're a full-time developer, you may view the title of this episode skeptically, or maybe agree, but don't think you fall into the trap of overcomplicating things. I think developers view over-engineering a lot like people view open-mindedness. People tend to think that they are open-minded and that others are not. I've never met a developer who over-engineered things and recognized their shortcoming in this area. And I think that's because it's so easy to rationalize a solution as the most modern technique or the most generic approach or the right way to do something. Luckily, there's another whole group that has embraced that complicated is not better, and they work really hard to make their solutions simple, easily accessible, and highly maintainable. And this group is typically made up of the people who've been in the business for a long time, aren't trying to prove their intelligence, they've been bitten by overly complicated systems, and they consider the craft of development to be making things easier, as opposed to their code being a testament to their skill. I've worked on some very complicated code bases in my life, and I absolutely appreciate the allure of technically interesting systems. There's a lot of mental reward that comes from the combination of the puzzle that needs to be worked out, gaining mastery over an enormous amount of code, the memory for tiny details hidden in hundreds or thousands of files, and the great sense of satisfaction that comes from going in with a scalpel and making a skillful change that fixes major problems. Being able to think through the design of something very large and deciding how to add on features or make significant changes, it's both a thrill and something that keeps developers going. So it's not without understanding this that I suggest overcomplicated is really the enemy of our jobs. We have to fight against our normal tendencies to not do this. If you know much about manufacturing history, you're aware of the shift away from artisan-built goods to mass production that was a major component of the Industrial Revolution. Goods became cheaper. Skilled laborers didn't need to be trained for years as journeymen learning a craft. Companies could produce more goods than they ever could before, but there was a group that was very unhappy. Skilled laborers were very unhappy with the New World Order. If your thinking is because they would lose their jobs, that was not the heart of the problem. The problem is that workers' satisfaction decreased precipitously. Where these people previously would go into their workplace and hand-carve pieces of wood and forge metal and perform the complicated act of assembly, now they were cutting one piece of wood and passing it along to the next person on the assembly line. Where in the past you would see the whole product from start to finish come together and have a profound sense of what you'd accomplished, being able to leave each day with a clear, measurable, visible sign of your progress, you are now a small cog in a much larger wheel. You couldn't leave feeling connected to what you had done. You could probably be replaced by someone else who knew your small piece of the job. And you have no clear vision for how your efforts directly impact the bigger picture. These are all really crushing changes for workers, but there's something so much more significant than all of these things. I think the biggest impact of mass production and assembly lines was that people suffered from a profound loss of challenge. We're a species with extremely sophisticated mental ability. We've solved amazing problems, conquered enormous obstacles, and used our ingenuity over thousands of years to tame our environment. We absolutely need challenge, and we need mental challenge. Without it, we suffer, our quality of life decreases, and we can start to lack a sense of purpose. The need for mental challenge is especially true for developers. We have a variety of motivations, but we are all a self-selecting population of people that need puzzles and mental exercise and a need to solve difficult problems. So you can imagine then that we're not going to be the best people in general to keep things simple. We're going to probably lean towards doing the opposite. I learned a very valuable lesson at 14 years old. I'd been teaching myself to program and had gotten some projects from families and friends that were just beginning to use PCs in their workplace. The first program that I got paid to write taught me about overcomplicating things with an experience I wish every developer could learn when they're early in their career. One of the data elements I was capturing in the system was the U.S. state that an issue had occurred in. The product owner wanted to capture the 2-digit state abbreviation, which I figured could be a challenge if you didn't know all the state abbreviations. So I thought to myself, I should definitely check this field for invalid state abbreviations. I created the list of states and compared the input to the list and presented an error if the state was invalid. But I thought, if the state is not in the list, my code is going to look through 50 plus abbreviations before it can tell the user was invalid. That's not very efficient. So I split the list into first and second characters to make the lookup even faster. With this in place, I would get the error message, but I realized users might not know what a valid state code was. Rather than tell them that they'd entered an invalid state, I should help them pick the one they want. I should mention that this was way before the internet, so this was actually a potentially realistic problem if someone didn't have the list of state codes on hand. So I created a window that would display all the states, basically a reference for the users, so they could find the correct one. I showed these things to my dad, and I think he appreciated the way I thought through it. He called my mom over to do the first test of the system, and I was going to get to see what happened when an untrained user used my code. But to my dismay, she entered OH as the state code and continued on. All of my hard work was for nothing. For her, there was literally no value to what I'd added. I could have taken this experience in a lot of different ways, but I think I had an epiphany right then. Maybe the things I think of in a vacuum, the things that seem important, the things that I think are essential features are really not. Maybe there needs to be a better way to decide what I should be building and how much time it makes sense to invest in anything that I'm building. This is so crucial in IT. Your time really matters. Unless you're working for an enormous company with thousands of developers and time that can be spent on features that won't be used without this having a negative impact on the bottom line. You may think that what you're building is going to save time in the long run or that it is the right way to do something. Trust me, I know that a lot of these mistakes are made with the best of intentions. But the point is, it's really, really hard to know what the actual value of what you're coding is. If you want to get a very different perspective on the code you write, do a tour of duty as a manager or a project manager. You'll have, let's say, 15 developers working for you. You start to really understand the impact of their day-to-day decisions. When you're not doing the coding, but you're waiting for the coding to get done, you'll start to ask questions in your head about why something is taking so long. You then sit with one of your people and maybe you start reviewing what they've done. And assuming you're at least somewhat on the hook for delivering something on a timeline, you will be horrified at the decisions they're making. Your top performers are likely pretty well in line with what you would have done yourself, but even they will do things that you will probably consider non-critical. But your entry-level people and your mid-level performers will be creating lots of work that you'll cringe at. This is no longer what feels like a stylistic difference, which you may have written off when you would do a peer review for others. You're on the hook for delivering, and this will really heighten your sense of urgency about only doing what is needed. Suddenly, you'll wish you could micromanage all of the decisions to stop features from getting introduced that will not add value. Of course, micromanaging is not the answer, and hopefully you'll have some good project management fundamentals or an agile framework or the like to help you keep things on track. Obviously, time boxing is great because it forces people to learn to make these trade-offs themselves. I'll talk about project management and agile in a future episode, but I just want to underscore that if you're a manager, getting too involved in the details with your developers is a good way to make them hate you. Now I want to highlight a few things that I've seen as motivations to overcomplicate things. Humans are not perfect, and I think sometimes our personal issues creep into our jobs and make us do things that are less than optimal. Our need to feel important or smart, or the need to satisfy our intellectual need for challenge, or just our lack of understanding of the bigger picture and all the things that can prevent us from keeping things simple. Also, as IT workers, there's often a component of resume building where people feel a need to build their skill sets even at the expense of their current project. People want to work with new technology, either because it is shiny and new or because they feel they need to have experience with it to stay competitive as an employee. These are all things I've seen countless times stop people from pursuing the pragmatic solution to a problem and pick something more complicated. Finally, there's an even more challenging issue that comes when people up the food chain from us have a desire to use a technology that is really a poor choice, and we aren't able to change their minds. This is something I've had to deal with multiple times in my career, and it ends up being a horrible situation. You're basically being forced to overcomplicate your technology solution because someone not as close to the problem is suffering from one of the problems I mentioned before. A need to feel smart or important, or feel like your company is developing something groundbreaking. If you work in IT long enough, you'll definitely run into this problem, and it is sometimes more frustrating than the more technical people making bad decisions. I realize I haven't given you a lot of specific guidance on how to tell when you're over-engineering or case studies for when this has happened to me, but this is such a large topic, I'm sure I'll visit some specifics in the future. But I wanted to start the topic with some general discussion around the problems and hopefully make you think about it. The first step towards simplifying is just recognizing the why behind what you're doing. Are you doing it because it is really necessary? Or are you over-architecting or developing a feature that's growing beyond what's really needed? And if it is, do you know why you're doing it? Is it maybe for some of the reasons that I mentioned before, as opposed to actually trying to meet the need? Thinking critically about your approach is a great first step to simplifying. And simplifying is a great first step to getting others on your team to think about it too. Trust me, an approach that is not overly complicated is going to pay dividends for you and your team because you'll spend a lot less time maintaining what you build. The real sign of experience and knowledge in your coding is your ability to keep things simple. Please, having worked on so many code bases, if you don't think about anything else, think about how to keep things simple from the start. These are things I've learned. Thanks for listening.